Wait, no, I need to be able to read that. Is that too much? I think Cooper, for me, is a kind of home. It's a place I rarely return to physically, but I find myself constantly returning to in my mind and in my actions. It's a place that formed me, well, in fact, it's the only formal architectural education I've had. And when you return to a place that formed you, you feel, or I would say, I feel an immense obligation to prove myself worthy of that investment. So I'm going to give you my apologies right up front for that, because I don't even know how to begin to scratch the surface in 30 minutes of everything I want to tell you about the world to the place that actually gave me the tools to see that world. So again, my apologies, but I'm going to do whatever I can. This is another home. And I look at this image often, actually, and not in a kind of tree-hugging, save the whales sort of way, but in a way that I find myself actually wanting more and more to be reminded, or I'm finding myself reminding myself of what it means to be here and what we are doing when we're making architecture. I think it's a reminder of what it means to be human living on the earth, and just what this human act of architecture actually is. Because when we talk about architecture, we're really only talking about how humans live on the earth. And again, forgive me the kind of existential digression, but for all we know right now, the only life that exists in the entire universe exists in this very fragile, thin film, kind of soupy mess that wraps this tiny ball floating around the sun in the middle of mostly nothing. So I think it's important that we understand that every building that we make, every building that we put into the earth was the earth. Every material we use started as the earth. Basically, we take material, we take the earth, we reformat it, we reprocess it, and we put it back into the earth as architecture. We live surrounded by our own inventions, and architecture or otherwise, the chairs you're sitting in, the chalkboard, the lights here, started as the earth. I don't even really know what that means myself, but I think it's really, really important to be constantly reminded of that. And we go to great lengths to get those resources. In fact, as I said, this is the only life we understand that exists in the universe, and it's the human form of that life that has almost total control over the resources of the earth. And we go to very deep lengths here to get sheetrock, gypsum mine. This is sheetrock. I look at this image and I wonder why we even need architects sometimes. We make monsters to extract minerals from rocks. And we make gargantuan infrastructure to basically will the earth into the shapes that we use to build. And I think it's important that we as architects are mindful of the kind of ways in which we receive the material, which we have a very intellectual relationship with, how it gets here. But now I can maybe start to talk about another form of home that we're all, as architects, maybe more familiar with, and home as a kind of center of domesticity. And I spend a lot of my time as an architect, whether working on literally homes or any other form of architecture, I think thinking about how architecture, what its role is in shaping the daily rituals of human life, quotidian or otherwise. Just what is architecture? How does it elevate? How does it shape the way we dwell on Earth? So I thought I'd show 3 projects today. One is the renovation of a building that was a home into an office. The second project is the renovation of a garage into a home. And the third project is a home that maybe ends up being slightly more than just a home. So the first project is the Heckscher Foundation for Children. We were approached by the director of this children's philanthropic foundation to create a new foundation headquarters for them. So they didn't do any programming on their own. They basically funded arts programs throughout the city, but they needed a place to have meetings, they needed offices, boardrooms, etc. So there's very little program to this. And they ended up in purchasing a building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a townhouse that was originally designed in 1902 by William Trowbridge, an architect. So it was a home designed by an architect for an architect. It went through many different incarnations in its life between the time this was designed and us inheriting it. And really the interior was a real pastiche of, there were sort of shades of its former glory, but it was really overlaid with sort of decades of bad decisions. And in fact, when we inherited it, it was the Sudanese ambassador's house. And because Sudan had no embassy in New York, it was also then the de facto embassy for the Sudan. And when we went to kind of survey the space, every door we opened, closet door or otherwise, there was a mattress with somebody sleeping in it, some political asylum seeker. It was a very strange kind of juxtaposition of an Upper East Side, very buttoned-up mansion and what was going on inside. But as an architect, we looked at it as a kind of typology, right? The townhouse is a very specific typology. It is a very long, narrow building. It's an infill space, it has a front and back. The front lends itself to a kind of generous space making because it has light. The back lends itself to the same kind of thing because that's where the light is. And the middle basically lends itself to circulation because it just doesn't lend itself to a whole bunch else. We're a kind of infrastructure that supports the life on either side of the building. So we looked at the project as a way of wanting to really question this typology. How can we look at something that we know so familiar? How can we make it maybe seem unfamiliar, and therefore slightly more beautiful as a result? So we kind of accepted the plan typology of a townhouse. As you can see here, basically these are the new plans: stair and elevator in the center, generous spaces up front, generous spaces in the back, and it'll allow some. Maybe we'll come back to this plan in a second. But what we thought we could question more is the section of the townhouse. This idea of stratification in a building like this kind of pancake structure where purple has no idea what blue is doing, who has no idea what green is doing, none otherwise are between them. We thought, how can we just slightly mess with that relationship? And I say only slightly because there's very little footprint here to work with, so it's not as if you can sort of tear out great portions of this. There is a kind of balance between the kind of usable real estate that we need and the idea of making an architectural idea out of this building. But we thought by doing that, we could create a set of relationships that just aren't there otherwise. And so you see the section, it's just a matter of, in a kind of Gordon Matt Clark maybe sort of way, slicing through these floor plates in order to make a space that's not even an occupiable space, but one that starts to set up relationships that couldn't be there otherwise. So you see that in the full-blown section, that idea taking place here, where these floors are all pulled away from the existing party wall. And in the transverse section, you see that that becomes a very long, narrow space that the stair also participates in. Let me just quickly go back to the plans then and show you that's that cut that's been made. So that cut envelops the stair and just this narrow sliver. So what that meant structurally was that by pulling those floors away from the wall, they needed to be supported otherwise. So rather than have a column lumber structure that brings them down to the floor, we really wanted to sense that liberation. So we realized that we could hang those floors from the roof. So we established this new structural frame within the building where the roof beam became the means to pick up that corner at each floor to liberate then the way that it connects to the ground level. You can sort of see that here, sorry for this. You can see the full-blown kind of construction of that hanging, right? So these levers are both in tension this member ended up becoming more than just a rod, because we realized once we liberated the floors from the wall, that the wall was not being supported any longer. So this piece had to be able to take the compression of bracing that wall back. So it is in fact in tension, it's hanging this floor below, but it's also in compression in that it's bracing the brick wall. And here is that top beam then, that everything is hanging from. And then you see, not very clearly here, but this is that space running this way through the building. And it ends up looking like this. This is the view immediately upon entry into the space, where you open the front door and you're immediately then given the full dimension of the building, both vertically, you can see all the way up to the sky, but then also horizontally. We kind of blew out the entire first floor of the building, which I'll show you a little bit later on. So you're immediately in a place where you understand where you are in the world. And I think that may be a kind of trope that we find ourselves constantly returning to. This idea of how do you orient the individual within the building, and how are you orienting the building within the world? By making these moves, you become aware of the larger world outside the building, as much as you become aware of where you are within that building. So you can see that space up at the top. At the very top, it's very narrow. It's just 2 feet wide. It's just enough to get light down into the building. And in fact, this rail that hangs here has a loop in it that can run along that track, which is for somebody to rappel down through to clean the glass or paint the wall whenever it's necessary. So at the very top floor, the glass wall is vertical. It then begins to taper and open wider as it moves down the floors of the building, to the point where at the base it's at least as wide as the entry boom, so that when you do walk through that entry, you're sort of enveloped by that new space. And you can see through the stair, you're now in many places at any one time. You're never in any one floor. You're always sort of the building. Just some views again, being in that stair and recognizing again the power of what is really a very straightforward and very simple move within the building. I think lends to very, very complex sectional and spatial relationships. I say that to you because I know how students often struggle believing that somehow they need, that somehow complication is the means to complexity. And I'm saying no. Here again, you see the idea of, and the kind of, maybe the slightly didactic quality of trying to describe what's happening in the building, what physically is happening in the building that you're experiencing as you move through it. This idea of hanging, I hope, is somewhat palpable by the things that we chose to expose versus the things we chose to conceal. The stair itself then participates in that same kind of space. We try to be very clear, again, by making that wall that everything's been liberated from very free and independent, and it's a kind of just single open element, pulling the stair away from that so that light is the means by which you sort of define that relationship, and at the same time articulating the stair as a kind of object in a space as separate from the wall that runs through that stair. So again, you begin to see then how just bringing light into that central space through the stair maybe allows you to think about that space slightly differently too. Even though again, it's a very narrow part of the building, it still becomes a place that you can occupy differently than you might before. Here also the stair, by being kind of liberated from the sidewall, its landing needs to somehow be supported as well. So we tried to make the structure do as many things as possible. In this case, that tension rod that's hanging the floors also becomes a way that the stair landing can piggyback onto that tensile member. And at the ground level, you can see that, again, that ambition to open that floor horizontally, so we're having that same kind of stretch of understanding in guess the y dimension is 0 and the x dimension. But what you also maybe begin to notice is that there's a change in grade from the street side to the rear yard side, which is behind us in this image. We went through many, many iterations to figure out how to make that transition happen. What we ultimately ended up doing was just gradually sloping the floor up to the point where the elevator entry is, at a grade that was at 1:20, so it wasn't considered a ramp, didn't need rails, didn't need landings, all that kind of thing. What that introduced also is then the reception desk became something that, by virtue of this sloping gradient, desk becomes bench at a certain point. So we call this bench or desk, whichever way you look at that. And then the rear area, this in fact was an enclosed space originally. This frame that you see is replacing a wall that was in that plane. And we also blew out this wall in order to make this kind of in-between kind of space, an outdoor space that's covered, and as a means where they can hold receptions between this indoor space and the outdoor space. These doors open and close. So you see that space there. The next project, as I said, is a garage that becomes a home. And it's also in New York in a small 1-block long alley called Charles Lane, which sits between Charles Street and Perry Street on the west side. And our client has lived in the area for many, many decades. Maybe not quite at the time that this photograph was taken, but what this shows you is the kind of operations that were going on that gave the area its name, the Meatpacking District. And for the longest time, this area of New York kind of held on to that grit and that kind of edge and kind of sketchiness. It was really the kind of only back of house of Manhattan that remained in Manhattan. And there were a few sort of restaurants that if you knew where they were, it was fun to come in here late at night and be part of this netherworld. Like most of New York that is celebrated for its authenticity becomes a victim of its own success, largely due to these towers of Bush-Meyer. I'm not blaming Bush-Meyer for anything, for a little bit, but it was really these towers that set off the kind of change of the Meatpacking District to a place where it's really unrecognizable to what it was. And so those were the terms under which we received this project. This is the site. It's interesting. This is a photograph of the site that we found just by coincidence through our research when we started out. This is a 1930s photograph by Bernice Abbott of Charles Lane, and you can see that it doesn't look a whole lot different when we inherited it. Before I get too deeply into the project, I wanted to talk a little bit about the client. He's an architectural, well, I guess you could call him an architectural photographer, but not in the way that we're maybe more familiar with what architectural photography is about. Jan Stoller is a photographer who is really interested in photographing the margins of architecture, kind of byproducts of architecture, or the sort of stuff of architecture before it's actually become architecture. The kind of waste, as I said, byproducts. I think of him very much as a kind of industrial naturalist. He's really able to look at kind of industrial space and kind of sublime space. I think this is a tie-dye factory. In any case, you can see this is the project, or the building as we inherited it, and you might see that it suffered from a fire. Very, very tiny building. I think it's 20 feet by 28 feet. And we basically had to hew to that same footprint. And our client was interested in, because of this rapid development that was going on, and because of this fire, he thought he could get in on the same kind of role and wanted to create a building, albeit at this very tiny scale, that rivaled the kind of attributes that of luxury and et cetera that was happening around him. Here's the back of the building again. You can see that it's very small, and there's a very, very small rear yard. This photo is taken from the townhouse that our client lives in. There's this 12-foot rear yard, and then the building itself. Here is the interior. You can see there's really nothing left to salvage. But the first thing you notice, I think, about the building is that there's absolutely no mediation between the inside and the outside. It's not even as much as a sidewalk. And I think if you really begin to think about how most New Yorkers, anyway, or really most people, move from the external world to their inner world, there's a lot of layers, right? You move, first of all, you're on a sidewalk which separates you from the street. You step from that sidewalk into a lobby, and from that lobby you may step into an elevator. That elevator lifts you from the street, exits you out into a corridor where you move then through to the door of your apartment, and you're finally in your home. So we thought it would be interesting to try to find a way to introduce that same idea of mediation, that same buffer, in this place that really had no means to offer it. So the way we looked at that is that this plan shows, this is Charles Lane, existing building on one side, existing similar sort of carriage house on the other side, and then this would be the townhouse, and here's the rear yard. We thought that by creating a very, very narrow sliver of real estate between the alley and the front door, you could begin to generate the same ideas of domesticity as anything else we're accustomed to. Just to show you the upper level, that bedrooms, on the top level stair, again, how do you fit all of the elements of domesticity into a footprint this size? Top is a roof. You can see this tiny, tiny little building vying for attention, and it's the Meyer Towers. This is the Asymptote building on Perry Street, which was started construction during our construction, and our client's townhouse. So I think what's also interesting is in a project like this, again, another kind of infill project, the entire identity of the building is really bound up in one single surface, that facade. So for better or worse, that's the means through which you sort of tell the story of the building. And we, I think, pretty quickly had a kind of impulse as what we wanted that to be, which was this idea of creating a kind of screen between the street and the interior, but then also creating a very clear sort of taut face, or maybe literally kind of face to the building above. So after the process that we all go through, that elevation developed into this, which looks like this, which is again a space where that lower level is a kind of indoor, outside space. In this case, the gate is open. This is actually, I'll show you where it's closed. The very taut glass facade, it stretches over the length of the facade above as a way to maybe not over-articulate. Because it's such a small building, we wanted there to be larger gestures if we want to get fussy with the space. So in fact, the spaces that are sort of define themselves within the space of that glass. Here you see with the gate closed, that becomes a very uniform relationship with the street. That screen was developed by just imagining the idea of a blade of steel that gets twisted 90 degrees from one end to the other, and then alternating the orientation of those one after the other to create what you see here. And that's the interior of that space. really everything is on this ground level. This is kitchen, this is living room, this is dining room, this is whatever else goes on in the house. The opposite view, you see the kitchen, and again, just trying to take advantage here. You're literally in between the inside and the outside. These windows open, just stretching the idea of the kitchen out into the rear yard to just appropriate as much space as one could, given the terms you're operating under. You can see the windows on this rear yard side are actually quite low. And the reason for that is, again, because the client, or basically these people, the landlord, lives in this building. You can see the relationship between your landlord and yourself is that very tiny, short space. So what we wanted to do is create the conditions where in here you still felt, again, a kind of sense of extension of the building and a kind of sense of ownership of that space beyond, without staring at landlord in the face. And then this becomes then a kind of the tableau looking from the landlord side. Just now I'm realizing that we gave so the last project is a home maybe that ends up being something more than just a home. This is a project that we completed from the ground up on prior to this, a completely undeveloped stretch of land out in the east end of Long Island. I love to show people this photograph of the site as we originally inherited it. It's an image, that seems like it's every architect's dream, right? The possibilities are infinite with this site. There's nothing you can't imagine happening here. But I maintain that this is not the site of this project. This is the site of this project. Let me explain. Here's that site again. Here's all its topographical naturalness and infinite possibility. Here it is with the kind of political construct of property line. So within that property line is also a scenic easement. So the client owns that land, but the client can't build on that land. Add to that the setback lines off of the property lines that becomes the buildable envelope. And then add to that the setbacks from natural conditions of the dew crest and the wetlands that you have to be a certain distance away from to demonstrate that you remain that way. Add to that that there are two separate flood zones that establish the elevation at which you can build a building that just by luck happen to run directly through the buildable area of the building. And by that time you basically, the building is basically designed itself. Maybe not quite, but you suddenly have a very, very different idea of what the site conditions are, what the kind of constraints are for building. So here are some of the studies of understanding that buildable area and how we could begin to occupy it. Make a long story short, we ended up landing on this idea of kind of double bar relationship with a kind of transparent bridge connecting them at the second level and a terrace with a pool connecting them at ground level. But again, you can see how much of that, which may, we like to think of it as it's kind of rolling the dice and just letting the seeds land as they will in the site, but you can see that they're very, very much aligned with what the kind of constraints of that building envelope as it was given to us. At the ground level, what we tried to do here, this is a fairly large house, so it was very much in our minds to how can we undo that? How can we make the impact of a very large house a fraction of what it would be otherwise? So we tried to tread very lightly at ground level, touching down on the parts where we needed to. And then at the upper level is where most of the action happens. The way we kind of imagined this organization was not so much this kind of striated idea of one bar is one program, one bar is the other, but that the bridge becomes the kind of social knuckle, so that there are two sort of ends of the bars become a social space, and the other ends become more private realm. So you can see here, kitchen, and that whole sort of dining happened on this end of the bar. There's a powder room here, and living room and a play area for a reading room happened here. And then in the other direction, it's an inverted C. Master bedroom, 4 bedrooms, an office, guest bedrooms, some service area. One of the even larger constraints on the project was a vertical one. There's a limit on the height that a building can be, and there are 2 different versions of that limit. You can be a certain height if you're a sloped roof building, and you can only be about 7 feet lower than that if you're a flat roof building. Our client wanted to be as high as possible because those dunes that we were pulling ourselves away from were the only things between them and their view of the ocean. And if you put out this kind of money for a house on the ocean, you're going to see the damn ocean. So you can imagine why that rule was developed, right? As a sloped roof house, only the kind of apex of that slope is at that height, whereas if it was a flat roof house, massive buildings up there. Well, we were able to convince the building department that if we made many, many slopes on a flat roof building, we actually complied with that language as it was written. So we went through different ways of trying to study how many slopes could exist on the structure and still comply with the rules. And this is basically where we landed. We kind of started with the idea that you might hear initial impulse of the sawtooth, went far afield studying other options, ultimately came back to that idea of the sawtooth. And it ended up doing a lot of things for us, but you can see here one of the things that it does is allow then a way of bringing light in. The roof suddenly becomes kind of a filter as opposed to a way of just insulating. And then also creates a surface on which we can begin to harvest solar energy. So that's the kind of ground view of the house. You begin to see how that sawtooth creates the identity of the place. And as I said, there were a lot of opportunities that started to present. You can see that how light comes through. But we were very conscious that we wanted the ceiling to be only about light, not to be about view. There was plenty to see horizontally in this building. You could poke a hole anywhere in this building, and suddenly you were a brilliant architect because you made this incredible view within this space. So it wasn't about that. It was about really trying to now find a way to, again, make one aware of your relationship to a larger kind of extensive system. And then given the orientation of the flat portion of that, the house has the largest residential solar array of any residential structure in New York State. Add to that kind of geothermal ground loop system for heating the pool and the domestic water, and a revegetation land. We actually scraped the existing vegetation off the site, took it to a nursery, and kept it propagated during the whole time of construction, and actually brought it back in place and replanted it largely as it was. Maybe a slightly better engineered version of itself, but still itself. So here you begin to see the effects or the possibilities or opportunities of not only the kind of character that gives the house, but then the qualities that it gives as well. Here that is detail. You begin to see how it affects the public spaces. I'll go through and talk about the text there in a minute. Much of even the way to stare, the way you enter the house, we were conscious of this idea of wanting to feel more like the house is sort of letting itself down for you to enter up into it, rather than something orderly and around and coming out all again in an effort to have this feel like it's somehow treading slightly differently on this property. Sure, this is here. It's actually interesting. This in fact, in the original design of the place was an exterior space. This was meant to be an outdoor space. These elements weren't here. This was meant to be a kind of covered breezeway that again left the building much more open to the elements than it was. These guys in our relationship with them started out as a guy with his girlfriend. They got married and had 3 children in the time that him first coming to us and us finishing the construction of this house. So we both worked really good. But anyway, so the point of that story was simply that they ended up needing more room, so we ended up enclosing the space. It was, you know, just as a way of telling you that lots of architecture that you see is the result of kind of improvisation, even during its life during construction. Here's a view then from that bridge that's sort of, again, a way of relating you to where you are in the house and a way of understanding the house's relationship to itself. Doing the opposite direction, showing the kind of porosity of the house, both through the bridge and through the sea. And one of the joys of working on this house in particular, and in working on these houses that are something more than just houses, is that these clients also sort of became collectors during the course of the design of this house. They became very interested in the work of Jane Olson, who I'm assuming you guys know something of her work. A woman who uses the idea of text as a kind of, at scale of architecture, as a kind of textual iconography on buildings. She was commissioned to do a project in this house, and we all sort of landed on the idea of where that project would exist, which is, you saw earlier, in that entry area, which in what was a kind of closed mechanical room with a large glass space. That became the wrapper for Jenny's work. And we worked actually very closely together because we were very concerned that that element looked as much like part of the architecture when it wasn't operating as a light piece. When it was on, it's when it was off, it needed to look right. So the idea of these very, very deep fins evolved, where the actual LED diode runs along the back end of these fins, which are hung off of these cleats. But at every LED diode, there's a glass tube that then runs through this piece and emerges at the end. So we get this idea of kind of serrated, textured surface. Here you see the mock-up of the piece, and here are some of the views of it in play. And I'm going to end with, because I think that time is an element in architecture. So many of these kind of presentations that are doing, we all know that images are our currency in architecture. We're sort of inundated with imagery. I think that too often we are lulled into this idea that this image is architecture. But I think that we can at least begin to think about the element of time in the way that we present projects, which I will hopefully do here. We had nothing to do with the making of this film. This was commissioned by the client themselves, so she was cheesiness, but I think it does help to give you a sense of just time as an element of architecture. What became most interesting about this crawl was the degree to which reflection played a role in, really not disorientation, but maybe reorientation of place and nature place, architecture place, the relationship between each other.
each station we're in, is there anyone left me? My apologies for the candles. I think it's next to really gives you a sense of how this operates. And there's no story version I shared with you. That's basically it. So thank you very much.
Open up the floor for questions and discussion. It's absolutely beautiful work with a great deal of precision. So much of it that you couldn't see but it's bloody evidence work. You did bring up rather forcefully the connection that all of this work has to the world, its resources, and a lot of times these are things that are just kind of plugged onto the side of discussions. But can you develop that idea a little further? Because, in a way, we're all somehow beholden to the forces of industry, believing that somehow things just work out there, a limited control over how we build things. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to those areas in which you feel able to be proactive or transformative or are actively
Well, I'm going to say right that I pretend to have done any of those things. I feel as much a victim of the kind of circumstances, and I don't feel I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that I figure out a way to be the moral architect. I am very conflicted about a lot of the work that I do and the way I spend my life and then how I'm going to continue being an architect. But I don't say that as a kind of nihilistic or cynical thing. I feel very, very optimistic about being an architect. But I feel like the way I typically talk about this kind of thing is that we've never made sustainability the subject of our work. We make it the object of our work. It's not about trying to talk the talk. It's just about being a good architect and continuing to think about what it is we're doing. Getting a house for a different owner. I would do it again because I also believe that there's something in the kind of laboratory of that world that allows you to contribute on levels that, again, I think are complex. But that house could have been made very differently. And it really is a house that, while it is the size that it is, it operates at a fraction of the amount of the kind of body energy of a house of a quarter its size. But again, I don't know that I really want to talk about that. What does that do for you or for me? It's going to feel good, not particularly. But so I don't even know how to begin to answer your question. I just want myself and you to continue to think about what it means to be an architect. What are we doing? How are we doing it? I'm not saying that because it's all wrong. I just, this is what we do. And whether you leave here as an architect or not, you can be given the tools to think about the world in a very critical way. And I think that's what's most important. You may not know it quite yet, but basically what you're doing is being given the ways in which you can think of very complex problems, whether that's physical infrastructure or whether that's kind of human dynamic, and make sense of those things. Make the thousands of questions that go into the design process look like one question. I think that's really what the role of architecture is. How do you make all of the questions related to making any project like this look like one question? And I think, I don't know, maybe another way of talking about what think we all walk around also thinking what we know is familiar. Things are familiar to us. And I tell you that there's nothing. If you spend enough time looking at anything, it becomes unfamiliar. And by becoming unfamiliar, it becomes new. You figure out new ways to deal with it. And I think that's also a very, very important goal of an architect, is just continuously not taking anything for granted. Sorry about that, but
There's another side of your project that maybe deals with the issue of goal and reach that kind of thing. That you have to go on every project. There is no issue with the specificity of plans on the side, right? And the other parallel form of consciousness that you can take and the actual project there at that place. That place is not any place.
yeah. You just talk about it, I can, but I think that's so fundamental. I think also just being aware of where you are at all scales. Yes, but I think that the way in which architecture can be basically the kind of it's the mediator, right, between us and the world. It's the way in which I can never overemphasize the fact that it shapes everything about us. It's interesting. I've been teaching Yale for over 15 years now, and we've recently given the project of an architecture school as a studio project, and it never ceases to amaze me the degree to which the A&M building becomes the project of the architecture school for these students, because that's where they live. They become central to what they know. And I think the more that you can kind of just be aware of how you're walking around the world, what you see, how you see it, how you're becoming that conduit for what you see in the world, and how you make that, and sort of reformulate that in your, that's important to you. You know, I don't know, I find myself also challenging a lot of the things that I left Google with. There was a kind of idea of modernism, kind of idea of profession that we were, I think, taught to sort of fight against, or be certainly wary of. I completely subscribe to that, but I also feel like we've got to participate. There's, I realize now I'm just kind of talking in large circles, but yeah, I'm going to take your question.
I'm interested in a little bit about, I guess, our relationship with the building itself and the city. And the second project, you mentioned that the client was jumping on the bandwagon of development that was happening with the towers. I'm curious to know, well, I wonder if you could just a little bit about the relationship or the conversations that had with the office at the time. It must have been a little bit, you realize that the certain, like you were saying, the old British history, very interesting in that sense, and yet, his house that is maybe looking to the future in terms of what's going to happen, rather than sort of hold on to an important piece of your history.
I think there's just two ways of doing that. One is, that was the client's idea, and we let the client believe that that's what the kind of object of the project was. It wasn't necessarily our idea. There was nothing terribly luxe about that project, but it was a real careful investigation or inquiry into what domestic space is. What is a domestic space domestic? How do we provide that in any context? But to your point, I think what's most important as an architect is that we are authentic to our time. I have no interest in either not touching something because I feel like it's a time that I want to somehow preserve. I do believe that we've got done a lot of work where we're operating on existing buildings. And I think that we're able to find a way to both preserve what's best about what's authentic to it, about when it was made, and also by what we insert within that building, actually make that even more powerful by how these things set off against one another. So while that may not be exactly the case in that project, I did feel strongly that I wanted to be authentic to myself as an architect in the 21st century.
I'm curious, in the second project, how much of the original house remained, or did anything, or what parts of it remained?
Well, basically the two sidewalls. It was whatever the building department defines renovations in two different ways, right? One is when you are working on less than 50% of the original building, it's considered basic renovation. When you touch anything more than that, it's considered reconstruction. There are many more onerous things that happen as a result of doing construction. The positive thing about that is you build larger. The negative thing is just part of the whole block. Our client was much more interested in maintaining scale, which is maybe also, again, a response to your question. That project actually could have been in the East Spray building. But, the building construction experts became that. So it is, in fact, a kind of holdout to a certain modesty that exists there. And could have been.
And it's sort of there's some easy,
Exactly.
very forward on the side.
So Mark, thank you very much for this. And I think that's somewhat what I'd like to address. And vis-a-vis your education here, and I think I was sort of very mindful of the language used to describe your projects, and probably was very infrequently the kind of language that we use in discussing projects here at school, where, issues of certain kind of formalism or a larger, very specifically architectural or spatial idea dominating conversation as opposed to client's needs, site conditions, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And very rarely the idea of beauty or pleasure about the making of space, and the pleasure that the space can afford its occupants, or the beauty that the space can bring to people who use it. Those words sort of enter your mind as you think about architecture in designing, or are they the result of those other parameters of thinking about design that yield the beauty and pleasure?
In my defense, I've never used the word beauty.
I know, but clearly, the spaces are
No, I think that's a good
incredibly
question.
essential and beautiful.
Thank you. I think it's a really good question, especially with this particular audience. So I come at it a couple of different ways. I think that one way of looking at architecture is that there's the object in space, and there's the space in the object. I'm much more interested in the space in the object than the object in space. But I also recognize that as students, what you get is your representation. You're always only pointing at architecture. You just can't get there. So I think that the beauty resides in the drawing. The beauty resides in the model. The precision resides in the representation. And I believe that for a long time. And I kind of continued to fetishize the idea of representation. I feel that's less important for me right now. I don't think it should be less important for you right now. But I am much more interested now in the experience of the fact of architecture and its representation. So maybe that's also why I'm less interested in formalism than I am in experience. But I think in all cases, architecture is a form of storytelling. And I just want to tell a clear story. And I think that's I think something that I absolutely took away from you. If anything, and the more and more I practice religious, and the more and more I am in the world, the more I realize that narrative is, I think, what actually makes, that's the kind of most fundamental thing about being human, is the narrative. And I think that if you understand that and when I say architecture is a form of storytelling, I'm talking about not just the physical fact of architecture itself, but the way you get to architecture, the way you talk about architecture here in school, the way you convey a way of thinking about architecture to your instructor or anyone else. It's storytelling.
But unless people misinterpret the dichotomy of object versus experience, it seems that your mastery comes in being able to specify the narrative that you specify, the materials that you specify, the conditions of life to the reader that you can anticipate and specify. They all seem to be embedded in your thinking. Or maybe it was their education and its focus on conditions of representation and anticipating those experiences that are at stake. But I wonder, because those experiences certainly don't just naturally happen, and they're not arbitrary. You still have to decide precisely the fact that certain windows were flush, other ones were popped out, and they require such problems as they produce resolutions. Anyway, so there's something about for handling a form that is in conversation with experience rather than being a part of it. And I just challenge that.
And I think you're right, because I don't ever want to say, I don't, again, form is the subject of my work. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in any of it. It's ultimately what architecture is. And this idea of windows being flushed on the judgment, that comes from just kind of exhaustion of possibility. That comes from iteration after iteration after iteration after. I mean, there's just reams of shit that led to getting to that point. And that's something that I'm so clear. Well, there's a kind of, what I remember very distinctly being here was a night at my desk where I was just like, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I remember at that point, my apartment was very close to the studio. I would just waste my time going from my drawing board at home to my drawing board at the studio. Just do that. I go to the studio again. I move to the really close to it. I get there and I'm distracted by the talking. So I go home. And nothing was happening. And I just exhausted myself of that whole game. That I honestly remember sitting at my desk and recognizing that I had this desk, I had this piece of paper in front of me, I had a pencil. I had everything I need to make everything I want to say. And it was a moment where I could just then sit down. And it was a kind of resourcefulness. That word sticks with me for a long time. Resourcefulness in all its guises, there's this idea of being able to make do with what you have, but also to sort of make something more out of what you have. And maybe that goes back to my kind of beginning of this whole thing. Like, what are our resources? How are we using them? I said to you as somebody who's sitting there trying to make architecture, how do you just kind of liberate yourself, unburden yourself from the idea of where it's all coming from? Just recognize it's coming from the relationship between your hand and your head. And that's really all you need. We have sharp minds and soft bodies. And that I really appreciate the idea of abstraction in form. Body just wants to know it means something soft. And I think that's kind of balance that we're also trying to find.